this is weird. This is one of those impossibly weird stories. You think this is either insane or it's true, because that's the only options. It's not boring. It's not predictable. It's either insane or it's true. And I got way deeper into that too. I realized some things about the Exodus story. There's a scene in there in the Exodus story where God sends poisonous. This is so cool. It's so stunning. I'll tell you a little bit about it if you don't mind. It's so cool, Joe. I can't believe it can possibly be true. So Moses leads his people out of the tyranny, right? But weirdly enough, they don't go to the promised land. This is very weird. They go into the desert. Well, why? Well, we're all, say, prisoners of our own tyrannical misconceptions and misperceptions, psychologically and socially. So let's say we free ourselves from those. Well, then we're nowhere. At least we were guided by that. That's why people have nostalgia for tyranny. It's like, at least we had enough to eat then. At least we knew who we were then. It's like out of the tyrant's grasp into the desert. And so you think, why don't people want to challenge their own preconceptions? It's like, yeah, it's out of the tyranny into the desert. And the worse the tyranny, the worse the desert. So if you've been tormenting yourself with tyrannical preconceptions and totalitarian obligations and you decide to drop it, or maybe you're shocked out of that by trauma, you don't go to paradise. You go to the desert. And maybe that's even worse. So no wonder people don't do it. So now the Israelites are out in the desert. You think, why are they there for 40 years? And maybe it's because it takes 3 generations to recover from tyranny. You're in the desert, man. And so the Israelites start worshiping idols. It's ideology. It's the same thing. And that's why, because they don't have anything to orient themselves, because they're not tyrannized anymore, and they get all fractious and they fight with themselves. And Moses has to spend like all day judging their conflicts, because otherwise they're at each other's throats. And anyways, they turn to false idols. And so God isn't very happy about this, and he sends poisonous snakes in there to bite them. So it's like out of the tyranny into the desert. Now we're fractured by ideologies. Now the poisonous snakes come. And so the poisonous snakes are biting them and biting them and biting them. And they finally break down and go to Moses and say, look, you want to have a chat with God and get him to call off the damn snakes? And Moses says, yeah, okay. And so he goes and talks to God. And God says, this is weird. This is one of those impossibly weird stories. You think this is either insane or it's true, because that's the only options. It's not boring. It's not predictable. It's either insane or it's true. Okay. And maybe we could start by thinking it's insane, but whatever. Moses talks to God, and God could just call off the snakes, right? That's what you'd expect him to do. But that isn't what happens. He says, go make an image of a snake in bronze and make an image of a stick, like a staff, and put the snake on the staff and then stick it in the ground. And then have the Israelites go and look at the snake. And then the snakes won't bite them anymore. You think, what the hell is... Okay, here's a doctrine from all fields of psychotherapy.
Okay.
Look at what you're terrified of, and you will get braver.
Unless what you're terrified of is a pack of wolves, and they're going to fucking eat you.
Yeah, well, look, it's not like there aren't real dangers, but look, if you're threatened by a pack of wolves and you go out and study them...
You realize you're fucked. Unless you have guns.
Okay, so the classic therapeutic treatment for terror and the poisoning that terror induces is exposure, voluntary exposure.
Yeah.
Okay, so the pattern there is face what you're most afraid of, and you will be free.
Okay. That makes sense.
Voluntarily.
Yeah.
Now that's a doctrine of psychotherapy now.
Right.
Okay. So now that's weird. That's weird. So God doesn't chase away the snakes. He makes everyone braver. Okay, because that's better than being safe. Bravery is better than safety. It's a more reliable cure for terror. Okay, now, that's cool. But this is even more cool. In the Gospels, Christ says that he has to be lifted up like the serpent in the desert. You think, what the hell does that possibly mean? Because, well, that's a snake first on a stick, and Christ is comparing himself to a snake on a stick? Okay, so what is this? What can this possibly mean? Well, I was thinking about that in relationship to imagery of the crucifix and the story that surrounds it. So Jung thought that the Passion story was archetypal because it's a limit story, like this debate at Oxford. You cannot write a more tragic story. It's impossible, technically. Why? Well, because it's a story of the aggregation of everything that people are afraid of. So There was no death more painful than crucifixion. That's why the Romans invented it. It was to punish political miscreants. It was the slow, agonizing death by suffocation, essentially, and dehydration and exposure. It's extraordinarily painful. Okay, so that sucks. That's pain, man. Plus, you know it's coming. That's part of the story. Plus, your best friend betrayed you into it. Plus, your people turned against you. Plus, they're led by a tyrant who doubts truth. Plus, you're a victim of the Roman Empire. Plus, you're completely innocent. Plus, everybody knows it. Plus, they choose a criminal to be released from this experience instead of you, even though they know he's a criminal and they know you're innocent. So, and you're young, and you've done no wrong, and all you've done is help people. So it's a limit story. Okay, so then you think, we've been looking at that limit story for 2,000 years in the image and in the story. What are we doing? Well, you're supposed to visit the stations of the cross, let's say. Okay, here's the idea. You hear the crucifixion story, and you play with it. Who are you? Maybe if you're female, you're Mary, and why is that? It's the Pieta, because you have to offer your children to the destruction of the world. That's female courage. That's the mother that doesn't hold her child back. It's like, go out. To what? Eventually your death and destruction. Go out. Leave me. Be in the world. That's feminine courage, man, to let her baby go. You're Pilate. You doubt truth, but you'll go along with the crowd. You're Judas because you betray your best friend. You're the mob. You're the criminal. All of that, that's you. You look on all those things that you hate and are terrified by. That's not a snake. It's like the worst of all possible snakes everywhere. That's what you're looking at. What do you see? You see death, you see destruction, pain, terror, tyranny, frailty, betrayal. Look harder, look harder, look harder. What do you see? The death and resurrection. You look far enough into the abyss, you see the light. Well, that's the story. That's the connection between those stories. And this unbelievably strange thing is that connection exists. It's like there's the strange story of the serpent in the desert, and we know that story is 3,000 years old, something like that. We know that. And then we know perfectly well that Christ said that he was allied, that his image was allied with that snake. That's written down. And even if you don't believe in the historical reality of Christ, someone still made that connection. And did they know everything we were talking about today explicitly? So what do we make of the fact that the shamanic experience, which is replicable cross-culturally and which dominated the human landscape for at least 20,000 years, we know that it involves a death and a resurrection, and an entry into paradise and a reunion with the ancestors. And so what does it mean? Who knows, man?
How
this is way past my knowledge, but I know that connection that I just told you about between the story in the New Testament and that story in Exodus. That took me like 30 years to figure out, because there's also the idea that the hero goes into the abyss to rescue his father from the belly of the beast. But that's the same idea, right? You go down, and I thought, I knew this the last time I went to lecture to, is like, you look into the abyss long enough and you see the spirit of the benevolent father manifesting itself. That's the case. That is the case. If you look into the depths of evil and suffering, what you see is not the finality of evil and suffering. You see the victory of the spirit that obtains victory over that. And then you might think biologically, well, how could it be any different, Joe? That's the spirit of life. Life is mortal suffering. It's like, but we live. What's the spirit of victorious life if it's not the benevolent father who overcomes the catastrophe of suffering? Like, what else could it possibly, even if you think about this just as an instinct, it's like, you're threatened by what's worse than death, and there are plenty of things worse than death that you can be threatened by. And yet you have a revelation that enables your transcendence of that. Well, what could it be other than the spirit that overcomes death in some fundamental sense?